Para dar inicio a esta conferencia, presentamos un video homenaje a su destacada trayectoria.
Gus Van Sant, homenaje internacional. Capaz de vulnerar las estructuras de la templanza narrativa, Gus Van Sant es un autor indispensable para comprender el cine independiente norteamericano de las últimas décadas. Capturó con su cámara los rostros de memorables personajes al borde del ocaso, en los límites de la propia extinción.
Original y a mejor actor de reparto para el gran Robin Williams. No obstante, su vena independiente le dictó volver a películas más personales y transgresoras. De aquí surge su denominada trilogía de la muerte, compuesta por Jerry, en la que un par de amigos abandonan toda esperanza al perderse en el desierto durante un viaje de excursión. Elephant, una exploración inspirada en el Columbine sobre el contexto detrás de una masacre en un colegio, la cual le valdría la Palma de Oro a Mejor Director y Mejor Película en el Festival de Cannes 2003. Y Last Days, sobre las últimas horas de Kurt Cobain previas a su suicidio.
Created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights.
Gus Van Sant se anotaría otro enorme éxito de la crítica con su película biográfica Milk, acerca del político y activista gay Harvey Milk, quien fuera el primer servidor público abiertamente homosexual en la historia de California. Su más reciente entrega, Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Feet, se basa en las memorias del caricaturista John Callahan y es protagonizada magistralmente por Joaquín Phoenix. Y es, por el momento, el último proyecto de una carrera que destaca con una gran holgura como una de las propuestas más originales del cine contemporáneo. Creador de una narrativa visual que debe postrarse en la cúspide de nuestro tiempo, Gus Van Sant equilibra con destreza el centro, un territorio y los márgenes que le interconectan, la búsqueda permanente de novedad y los hilos conductores que mueven sus obsesiones desde la primera hasta la última cinta. La humanidad de su visión y la curiosidad interminable por las posibilidades del cine en su faceta más íntima y cambiante lo vuelven una presencia insustituible en el panorama fílmico mundial. El Festival Internacional de Cine Guanajuato se honra en extender un merecido homenaje a Gus Van Sant, artista esencial de nuestra época, quien es capaz de llevarnos hasta regiones insospechadas de nuestra mirada y moldear una obra que se mantiene fiel a sí misma, rindiendo un lugar privilegiado a la creatividad, los sueños, la extrañeza y las cualidades más inquietantes de la imagen en movimiento. Gus Van Sant, en Guanajuato.
Con ustedes, el cineasta Gus Van Sant. Para moderar esta conferencia magistral, queda también con ustedes el guionista y productor cinematográfico, quien actualmente funge como subsecretario de Desarrollo Cultural de México, Edgar San Juan.
Hello, buenas tardes. Thank you everybody for being here. First of all, I want to thank the privilege to be here with Gus Van Sant, which is a great honor. I admire your films, and you have been an inspiration for not only for me, but for a generation of filmmakers and creators. Also, I want to thank Sarah Hodge and all the volunteers and all the team from the festival which has made this happen. Thank you so much. Please give us a... Thank you very much. Also a little announcement. Para quien quiera tener traducción simultánea, la conferencia va a ser principalmente en inglés. Y hay traducción simultánea que pueden pedirla en la entrada con una identificación y solicitar unos audífonos, y así van a poder escuchar en castellano, en español, todas las preguntas traducidas de manera más sencilla. También la dinámica que vamos a realizar hoy va a ser principalmente, first we're going to talk a little bit about influences and about art and cinema, and then we'll open the space for Q&A from the audience and to the director. Okay, so I just want to start talking about the way you became a filmmaker. The normal path for filmmakers is from cinema schools or audiovisual environment. But in your case, you came from the world of art. How does that define you as a director?
Well, I think the first influences were both art. My art teacher in junior high school, so I was quite young, 13 and 14. At the same time, there was an English professor who was showing films for some reason. He was having us read these great books like Waiting for Godot and Lord of the Flies. And at the same time, he was showing us experimental films from the Canadian Film Board, which resembled like the New York Underground. I think the New York Underground was too racy for junior high school. So he was showing us things that were for school, but they were people that were painting on film, experimental cinema. He showed us a film called Very Nice, Very Nice, which you can see online, which is was amazing to us. And then he showed Citizen Kane, which is the one that always gets them, like gets the kids. Like everyone always cites the Citizen Kane as their first, influence, and it was for me as well. At the same time as he showed Citizen Kane in class in 16 millimeter, it was also scheduled on a low budget New York City TV station, Channel 9. They were low budget enough that whatever film that they would show it every day, 3 different times. So if you wanted to watch Citizen Kane more than once, you could watch it 10 times. And I think I watched it many times. And I realized, as a 14-year-old, that there was psychology involved in cinema. And it wasn't just escape, it wasn't just entertainment, but there was other things. Because I think probably the reason that it influenced so many other filmmakers as well, that it's very, it's simple, it's simple enough for a 14-year-old to understand, but it really got me interested in more like traditional movie theater cinema. At the same time as he was showing us the experimental works. In my art class, I had an art teacher, 1961. He was a gay man. He was an out gay man in 1961 in a very conservative community in Connecticut. And he was jealous that the English professor was showing us art films. He was showing us the Canadian Film Board films, and he said, those are art films. They're not really English films. But there was these two influences at the same time when I was young. Later, I got a summer job 2 years later and saved my money up for a 8mm camera, and I started to make experimental films because I was painting as well because of the influence of the art teacher, but the thing that was going on in sort of my area in New York City was a lot of painters like Stan Brakhage or Ron Rice or other experimental filmmakers, Warhol, they were starting to make films. So it's something that a painter did. So I thought I had sort of a direction as far as an experimental cinema. I didn't really think about dramatic cinema at the time until later. So those are the earliest.
Cool, because also the first time that I saw Drugstore Cowboy, the dream scenes reminds me of some paintings from Magritte or Dali. Even in the video clip San Francisco Days, which I recommend a lot, I saw Magritte in that scenes. And at the moment, which are your main influences in art? Or
Magritte in some of the films, or
yeah.
A shot that looked like Magritte.
Yeah, in the Drugstore Cowboy, in the dream scene sequences, I find something like Magritte.
Like Magritte. I think Magritte. I mean, the surrealists were very influential. Also, to I think a young person, it was so playful and unexpected and outrageous that for young people, and also it was the countercultural revolution. So all these things were happening in the '60s. That the surrealists were, interesting. So there is an influence. I don't know if the thing that usually I liked about Magritte was the sort of light sky and the dark, cityscape.
Cool. So, can we talk a little bit about Mala Noche? Mala Noche is a short film based on Walter Curtis' novel, and I think it's vital on this moment because it's an important reflection about the communication problem, and especially between Mexico and USA. We are so close in a way, but also we are far away in another way. So I think it's your short film and one that the first one that became kind of recognized worldwide. What do you want to transmit, or what do you want to express, and why did you pick this novel or from Curtis?
Let's see. I had been living in Hollywood. I moved there after college, where I majored in film. I moved to Hollywood. Worked for a comedian named Ken Shapiro. He was working on a new film. His original film was called The Groove Tube, which at the time it was skits. It was like comedic interludes, and he was writing his next piece, which was called Ma Belle, which was about phone freaks, people that used the phones for like for fun, basically. Early tech guys, basically. Okay. And so he was writing. His writer was Lauren Michaels, who basically, with the idea of Ken's early film, The Groove Tube, he sort of took that idea and pitched it as Saturday Night Live. Okay. And Lauren had left, and he was like telling Ken, "Come to New York. We're going to do this TV show." And Ken had sort of grown up in New York, so he didn't want to go. So this became like the longest running TV show in America. So Ken was very bitter that his movie was so successful as a TV show, and he didn't really have a connection to it. Lauren had just sort of like used the format. So I did that in Hollywood. I made a film right after that called Alice in Hollywood, which was a 16mm feature that wasn't so good. I didn't get into any film festivals. It was very sort of a tragedy that, the end result wasn't as captivating as I hoped. So I had moved to New York and saved up money to make this next film, Mala Noche, which was set in Portland. Meanwhile, I had gone to high school in Portland after the school in Connecticut, and I frequently went back there to visit. And I had actually worked in 1977 on a film called Property by Penny Allen about a group of hippies that try and buy the houses that they live in, the houses that they pay rent. They try and go to the bank and buy the houses so they aren't exploited as people that needed to pay rent. And so it was kind of this socialist comment in the art community of Portland. And Walt Curtis was the lead character, and Walt Curtis had written Mala Noche. He was the author. And Penny gave me the book. It was a very small book about his experiences a couple of years earlier working in a grocery store and meeting two migrant boys who were living in the old part of Portland and working in the fields outside of Portland for vegetable companies, picking vegetables. And they would live in the city, and then they would go out on buses out to the fields to work. And in the winter there was no work, so some of the workers just stayed in town so they didn't have to go across the border, which was dangerous. And they had nothing to do, so they got in trouble. They were young. They were, say, 18 and 20. or maybe younger, and they just were getting in trouble. They were pulling pranks, and Walt was in the same community, working in a sandwich shop in a grocery store. So they would visit him, and he would give them sandwiches because they had no money. And it was about their relationship. He fell in love with Johnny, one of the boys, and was writing this book about this kind of a death in Venice obsession over the beauty of Juancito, and this sort of tragedy, this sort of like thing that you might read in a novel that I'd never really seen in cinema. So I thought after the experience of Alice in Hollywood, it was something that I thought was challenging as a story for basically an audience, with all these different this gay relationship and the migrant workers and the old town in Portland. So I squandered my money that I made in New York on this film. And I mean, these years are going by, like 2 years to save up the money, a year to cast Malanoche, just to find people that looked correct for the parts. Nobody wanted to be in it. It was a gay relationship. The people that we found that were actual workers in the Portland area were very excited, but then they never were going to really do it because it was too I think sexually like provocative.
Okay.
It wasn't the cinema that they ever had seen. They also made quite a bit of money in the fields compared to what we could pay them as actors. So it took a year to cast these two characters, and then another year to edit, and it was just on and on and on.
Cool. And the music always plays a role, and it's super important in your films, and I can imagine in your life. You have worked with David Bowie, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Elton John, Chris Isaak, Delight, Stone Temple Pilots, just to mention a few ones. Can you share with us how is the process to bring a song into a different form of art?
The first video I did was for David Bowie. It was, I hadn't, or maybe I made one for Victoria Williams, which was a low-budget piece, and then I got this offer to make a video from a reissue of Fame, which was a project that David Bowie was working on. And so because it was David Bowie, I just couldn't say no. I couldn't, pass it up. I thought this was crazy that I was being asked in the first place. And it was because we had released Drugstore Cowboy, and it was quite popular in, certain artistic circles, and Bowie was a fan of it. So we made this this video for Fame, which was okay. It didn't turn out really the way that I had planned. It was sort of a practice, I think. Right at that time, MTV was new, and a lot of filmmakers were starting to make videos, and there were whole sort of little industries springing up that were making videos for bands, and that they, as a way to like sell their records, like the MTV became very popular, which I think we had doubts when it first went on the air. I think all the filmmakers were sort of laughing at it, and then it became very, very successful and also necessary for your release of your album. So I thought that I started to get a few more offers. I found a video sort of contact, an agent, and was making different things. I had cast Flea in, I wanted to cast Flea in Drugstore Cowboy, and he didn't make the cut. It was like sort of a group decision. I think that he was one of my favorites, but he says he's never seen Drugstore Cowboy because he didn't get cast in it. But I knew them, and I cast him in My Own Private Idahoe. And so we got to be friends, and so he had asked me to shoot a video for Under the Bridge, which that album, and particularly that song, had become sort of their breakthrough moment in rock and roll, because they were sort of a punk band and a very kind of underground band, a Hollywood band, that were very risky. You know, they would play naked on stage. They did all kinds of strange publicity, and this was their all of a sudden kind of mainstream radio hit. And after Under the Bridge, they became like more of a college rock band. Not that they wanted to be that, but they, you know, they sort of found this sort of amazing success, which continues today. So we, made that for them. The process of like, you know, having a song influence your, interpretation of their music in cinema is, I don't know if I could describe it. Just think things up, and they usually, in my case, they were visual. They weren't trying to make sense. They weren't trying to be stories or anything like that. They were visual pieces. I had done, I think with the Chili Peppers, it was a sort of thing that a technique where I was using multiple images and combining them and using almost like a collage. And on a video set up in a TV station, you could block out sections of the screen and put other images into them. So you could make this live-like collage of images, which I think was something that I first did in Under the Bridge. But later I did little videos for William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. It was the same kind of like multiple image technique.
Okay. Getting back a little bit on cinema, also as a screenwriter, I would love to know more about your adaptation process from a novel into a script. For example, Drugstore Cowboy comes also from the novel by James Fogle. How did you translate it into a film? How was the idea? I had read that the novel is amazing. It's his only novel from Fogle, who was at jail at the time for the things that he has done as a junkie and as a thief. But he's quite a character, right?
Yeah, the techniques usually tend to be nuts and bolts and pretty boring. The book was a very kind of classically pulp fiction piece of work that had been, sort of a style of fiction for a long time. These sort of underground stories about criminals and Jim Thompson style novel that I think was something that somebody that was in prison might actually spend their time doing, about writing stories about their own adventures as people living on the outside of their prison life, and trying to kind of cut corners legally. In this case, they were actually a group of friends who were they identified as thieves. They didn't identify as junkies or they weren't murderers. They just stole things and sold them. So they were originally, Fogle had spent his life going in and out of prison since he was, I think, 13. He came from Washington State, and it was like in the 50s, I think, you could end up in prison at a younger age than maybe you could now. I don't think he was going to the mainstream prison at 13, but he had many stories. He had 4 different novels, and they came to me by way of a filmmaking friend who was in a writing program with the author of The Birdman of Alcatraz. And the program was created by him the author of Birdman of Alcatraz had a little sort of school where he would give lessons to people trying to write outside of prison, but he would also have shops inside. And he would connect the people inside prison with the people outside to help the prisoners send their manuscripts around to publishers to get them published, because it was hard for them to mail their works out through the prison. So Dan had been hooked up with James Fogle, and he had a collection of his novels, and he was trying to get them published, but he was also trying to get them seen by people in Hollywood. And Dan wanted to write the script, and he had written one of the scripts, and was showing it to different filmmakers in LA when I met him, and he gave me Drugstore Cowboy, and he gave me another one called Satan's Sandbox, which was about something inside prison. And I adapted both of those into screenplays very quickly. I was at that time, through Malinoche, I had found an agent in Hollywood, which was sort of something I had been avoiding because I thought agents were bad, just because of the Hollywood system. I was very outside the Hollywood system. I thought agents were something that you could step around. I didn't realize the control they had. So I had this agent, which I wasn't really paying too much attention to, but he was sending me around to studios to meet executives and show them screenplays that I was writing. And I showed them the manuscripts first, and then I realized I needed a screenplay. And I wrote both of those into screenplays. And right about then, Malinoche in the LA Gay Film Festival had won a LA Film Critics Prize, a prize that the film critics gave to sort of like the sort of outsider independent artists. They gave prizes to like Best Actor was Jack Nicholson, Bertolucci won for like Best Director for his film. I can't remember the film that year, but they were very the LA Time or the LA Film Critics Awards, and then they gave like a sort of guest prize to one of their favorite people, just to help them basically. So I had won that one. It was called the Best Experimental Dramatic Film Maker. And so if you just left off the experimental, you were the best dramatic filmmaker. And so we left off the experimental. And the agents, I was living in Portland, Oregon at this time, and I also had sort of contempt for award ceremonies and prizes and so forth. So I thought, well, maybe I'll send my friend to pick up the award, and I'll just stay in Oregon. And I called my agent and said, "Did you know that I won this award?" And he's like, "Are you kidding?" "Yes, of course I know. We're sending copies of Malinoche to like everyone we know, and we're sending scripts of Drugstore Cowboy." And I said, "Oh, do you think I should come down?" And he's like, "Of course you should come down. This is very, very important." So I went down, and on that trip, I found my agent, and he, or I guess I found the agent first somehow, and then, because we had already shown it. The award ceremony was later, so they were sending it out to everyone they knew, and somebody, Avenue Pictures, decided to do it. And what was the question, though?
Well, about the process of adaptation from the novel.
The adaptation,
to,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is how the adaptation worked. I mean, it was a typical manuscript. It was typewritten. It was. I took parts of the book. I marked off the ones that pieces that I didn't want. I tried to make it smaller. I literally like sort of transposed the writing into screenplay. Like I was being very true to James Fogle's original concept, and story and style and humor. All the stuff that you see in that film is really Fogle's work. And it really was like redacting part, cutting it out. There were Xerox machines, there were no computers at the time, and just retyping it. Things that we learned things about the group of bandits, the Fogel and his friends. Through Fogel, we were writing him in prison, and the friends, they were also in prison, and there were way more stories about the group and adventures. So there was more material than we could really handle. And we visited the sister of James Fogel, and she had pictures of them. So they were like, the art department could see the pictures and the costume, the outfits that they were wearing, which were very odd, like in the film. We were basically, I and also the crew and Matt Dillon, everybody was trying to be very true to the original source, in an effort to make something that was truly like film noir or Pulp Fiction.
I can imagine that the prize that you earned in the LA Film Festival helped you to obtain the names that you wanted for Drugstore Cowboy. Matt Dillon at that moment was on the top, but probably in other genders.
Yeah, Matt was introduced to me through my agency. Once you're in, William Morris was the agency. Once you're there, the agents are kind of like filtering all their projects around. And Matt, in particular, was interested in working with younger, coming up filmmakers. And so I think he saw Malanoche, and it was like, this guy, I want to work with this guy. So he was very high on it, but the production company that was producing it, they had higher ideas. They had just made Kiss of the Spider Woman, which was very successful, and William Hurt had won an Oscar. So they had this, this style, and so we started at Jack Nicholson.
Okay.
And I went and got the script to Tom Waits, and Tom Waits wanted to do it.
Okay.
And so my first meeting with Avenue Pictures, I mentioned that we had Tom Waits, and they were sort of not very impressed. He was in another film that they were making. So I had to call Tom Waits and say, sorry, man. Like,
ouch.
he says, oh, they're not buying my act, huh? And I said, well, I guess, and next in line, I think Sean Penn was there, Matthew Modine, and these are people that passed. And then we sort of like pushed Matt into it. Matt was a lot younger than the original character was around 40 years old. Matt was 26. And he got the part.
And the rest is history. Also following these narrative questions, you credited Shakespeare's Henry IV in My Own Private Idahoe. Do you want to talk about this unique and modern interpretation of Shakespeare? For My Own Private Idahoe.
I had, let's see. I think I had seen Chimes at Midnight, which was an Orson Welles film, which was an adaptation of different Falstaffian segments of Shakespearean plays and sort of put together. And the way that he made it sort of reminded me of kind of the sometimes the artistic community or just the sort of bohemian community in Portland, Oregon. The sort of underground characters like Falstaff, sort of they become robbers in Prince Hal and his sidekick Pistol. They become robbers with Falstaff, and they resemble people in modern day. I think the way Wells was handling it partly. So when I first had my William Morris agent, one of the scripts, along with Drugstore Cowboy, was a script where I was also using Shakespeare to tell a story about Portland characters, and the script was completely Shakespearean. The first one that I had, which had I can't remember the title right now, but I think Minions of the Moon. I think that was a line in Shakespeare, and people would read it. The executives that I was meeting were very like middle executives, so nobody could really like make the movie, but I was meeting a lot of people. And so I had that sort of on my shelf. After I made Drugstore Cowboy, there was that script. There was a few other scripts about these male street prostitutes in Portland that one was called In a Blue Funk. That one was about the Mike character and a German auto parts salesman. Then there was the Shakespeare, and then there was a short story that I wrote that was called My Own Private Idahoe, which was Ray Manji from Malinoche, and his young nephew named Jorge, who was I think 10 years old, who was kind of this Angelo, my love, is that character who, even though he was 10, he was trying to pick up girls who were like 25 on the street. He was very like full of himself, and so it was a script about, or a short story intended to be a film about them. And so after Drugstore Cowboy, I just put them all together into one piece, and kind of like while the editor was arduously working on Drugstore Cowboy and my mornings were off, I would be writing My Own Private Idahoe as the next piece.
And the title of the film comes from the song from the B-52s, even that in the film doesn't.
It doesn't, yeah. Well, that came from my visits to Idaho. There was a group of friends that lived in Sun Valley, Idaho, and they would, because they lived in Idaho, and the B-52s record had just come out at that time in the 70s, they would sing that song all the time. So I think that it was partly that I had been to Idaho, and that it was sort of dreamy as a story, and that and there was this title, which was a great title. So it was borrowed from the B-52s, and it does sort of have. I mean, he does go on a journey into to Idaho. So aside from that, it doesn't really have too much of a connection.
And because Idaho, I think, is the perfect film. I love it. It's amazing the way it shows the reality of these characters. And I think that because of the freedom, the themes and characters that you portrayed in Idaho, it jumped into our society like a clean and pure oxygen. How do you think this film changed the film industry, and especially the indie world?
Well, the screenplay, like, I think that up until then, the things that I had worked on were pretty traditional. They were trying to tell a story in a way that resembled movies that I had seen before. And I was kind of, in some ways, playing a game that I imagined existed, which I don't think really exists, you know, of cinema as it was in the U.S. and also the rest of the world at that time in 1989 or the years that I was writing it. And I think Idaho attracted enough attention that I sort of was confident to kind of do whatever I wanted. Sort of it freed me up so that I could, you know, as also just an experiment, a personal experiment, to see what would happen if I just did exactly what I wanted to do, as opposed to let kind of the template of, say, the screenplay or the template of the modern movie influence me. And a lot of filmmakers, I think, had been doing this already. I mean, Herzog, in particular, was very influential, and we looked at Herzog's films in making My Own Private Idahoe. We were watching Heart of Glass, and we were watching Strosek. Those two films I showed the cast and the crew, as, you know, like, so this is the kind of film we're making. So there was a connection to other cinema. It wasn't completely freed of influences, but through Herzog, I think there was more like kind of validation of like, you can do this, you know, and he was already breaking like every rule and making beautiful films. So there were other influences. I think Samuel Beckett was a big influence. So I think that when I was writing it, I was literally just following my own instincts that I could come up with without sort of using cinema rules. And yeah, I was very concerned, although it was an experiment, and experiments are concerning. So I just forged ahead and made this screenplay, which was very strange. It was 70 pages long. It was written in different typefaces. By then, Apple had made a computer, and Steve Jobs had put all the different typefaces that you could choose, like 20 different typefaces. So it was written in different typefaces and different sizes of type throughout, and different punctuation as well. And sometimes the letters floated in a sort of E.E. Cummings style, poetry style, through the page. And I remember giving it to executives at, say, there was an executive at Universal that wanted to see it, and so I gave it to him, and he said, I liked it, but we could never do this. And partly, I think, in the world of Hollywood, partly you needed to make a screenplay that was exactly 118 pages long, and exactly like, you know, 12-point or 10-point type that was courier type. And if you even today, you need to do this. If you varied, it just sent off, you know, red flags. So you might not get your film going if you didn't follow those particular rules. I mean, Hollywood's interested in controlling the project, so it's an indication that you may not be controllable if you vary from just the typeface of your screenplay, which is silly. So none of those guys did it. We sort of were helped along. It was, a lot of people were sort of standoffish about that screenplay, and it was really casting River and Keanu that helped get it going at New Line. And they were really sort of excited about the actors, more than maybe the screenplay. So we got that going. And again, I forgot the question.
No, but also many critics has compared Idaho with the Misfits, also because of the power and the energy that has, and also the cast that you crafted. And also it changed the shape of the industry, because you can talk a lot about the team that you wanted with freedom, and talk about these misfits and transform them into a commercial success. Because I can imagine that the Idaho was released in every place in the world, distributed in the States with a lot of success, and also was in Venice, was in a lot of festivals. What happens after that kind of success? I mean, you have to stop a little bit and then to think what.
I mean, I still am very unaware of like what sort of performance or like support I get from like its release internationally. I'm surprised usually. Like when I come here, I'm surprised that, you know, some of you know that movie. It's like, I know that it in the States it did quite well, but it's very invisible to me, like what it does in each country, unless I go to the country. But even then, it's hard culturally to really know how that works. You know, so I wasn't really still not really aware of it, and also not really aware of its influence and how it influenced other filmmakers.
Well, its influence is huge, and here in Mexico, it's a classic, and everybody loves it. Talking about To Die For, is prophetic in the way that anyone can do for a like, or for 1,000 likes. It's a very sharp film. The cast that you crafted is astonishing. How was the process to deal with a great script, a super cast, big studios, and your commitment as an artist?
What was the 1,000 what?
Likes. It's like Nicole Kidman wants to be on TV. She wants to be a celebrity. So now I think that everybody wants that their photos becomes a huge success with likes, and that their Instagram story become.
Yeah, it was an early period of what we have on Facebook. Well, it was the period that, let's see, it was the Pamela Smart case that was, she lived in New Hampshire. She had a radio show, the original story. And she taught the kids that were in high school, she taught them about having a radio show. And meanwhile, she convinced one of them to kill her husband because she was, I think the husband wanted, it wasn't the same vanity thing. I don't think that there was this thing about afraid to have children because she would look different. I think, which in the film we have, but she convinced her student to kill her husband, which he did, and it became right at the same time. There was cable news, which was new. Cable was new, and the way that these channels were constructed, there were so many of them internationally that all of a sudden this small town, Durham, I forgot the town, New Hampshire, everyone from around the world with their cameras like descended, and it became an international crime story. And there were people like Larry Clark went to the trial, and he photographed the people in the trial. I guess, I don't know how he did that, but those pictures appear in some of his books. Those were around. That book was printed. Joyce Maynard had been a columnist, and this was her first novel, and she lived in the town, so she wrote about her fictional version of the Pamela Smart story, and it became To Die For. And so it was really a comment on the new media, which was very new at the time. It just didn't exist before. It exists now, but it was the first time. So we were super fascinated by like what that meant. We didn't know what it meant, but it seemed crazy that that it was so all-pervasive internationally, and also through the States. And Buck Henry had been asked to be the screenwriter, and we had the same agent, and the producer, wanted me to direct and Buck to write. This was her like dream. Buck had written The Graduate and other things, and he was a very funny writer, and also very sort of precise and investigative, and a lot of things. So I remember him adapting it, and I remember calling him on the phone one day, and he couldn't talk because he said he was watching perhaps the most interesting thing he'd ever seen, that year, and it was on TV. It was Charles Manson defending himself in court. So you see, they would air things like that. They don't do this anymore. They would air Marlon Brando in court or Woody Allen in court. It would be, you could watch the whole court case. The Menendez brothers were on TV. OJ was on TV at this time, and it was out of control, basically. And so there was this atmosphere of this new media that kind of was inspiring the whole project, and was, we loved it and hated it, and all at the same time. I think the studio was very, very the producer was a very pushy producer, Laura Ziskin. She got Amy Pascal, who's at Sony, interested in it, and we made a very low-budget film within the world of Sony. Sony only put like $7 million into the project, and Rank Film in England, that represented the rest of the world, or at least half the world, they put in $7 million. So it was a $14 million film, which was, I think at the time, films were maybe, they were a little more. They were maybe 25, 30, 35. And when we were done with the movie, it tested very, very poorly. Like the worst, I think one of the worst tests I've ever had. We were encouraged to keep editing. So we were editing for like a year, and finally the tests didn't change. They're always testing like 33, which is quite low. And so we were basically finishing it and kind of giving up ourselves, thinking that the movie was sort of a wash. And the studio did as well. And then Rank Film, on its own, had sent it to Cannes Film Festival. And so we all went to Cannes, and at Cannes, the New York Times wrote something really good about it. And all of a sudden it changed from like this loser film to like something that Sony wanted to actually push. And it became a pretty successful film, and they actually did a regular release. It was kind of scheduled for like the shelf, actually, and then it was saved by this review. And so it wasn't a very happy like studio situation. It wasn't like we were on top of the world at a studio. We were very underground in our own studio.
After To Die For, you received a script, Good Will Hunting, from two young writers, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, who at the moment were still nobody. And you made a huge film. How was the experience with Good Will Hunting?
It was great. It was a great experience. That film, I mean, the films always seem to have sort of a similar life. You know, they were always Drugstore Cowboy, To Die For, My Own Private Idahoe, were all films that kind of looked down on within the companies that they were made. They were always sort of the black sheep. Drugstore Cowboy was kind of the least, you know, within the powers above you, the executives. It was looked down upon as an experiment for them. Like, probably won't make any money. But all the films were always like that. Good Will Hunting also had this stigma because of Ben Affleck and Matt Damon were contractually guaranteed to be the lead characters, and they weren't. They were they were immovable because they knew that if they weren't the lead characters, they would like become writers perhaps, but they wanted to be actors, and they wanted to do the Sylvester Stallone thing and cast themselves in their own screenplay. And because of that, even though the company that ended up making it, Miramax, had high hopes of casting Brad Pitt and Leo DiCaprio, who had both read the script. It's a long time ago, but they had read it, apparently, according to Harvey Weinstein, who's in prison. It's a whole other story. But he was, kind of arguing with, I guess, Matt. I'm not sure. Ben was maybe busy, but Matt would tell us these arguments that they would have, and he was going to pay them like $1 million to just walk away from the acting roles, and he just said, "No, we're not doing it. We're in the film." And so the film became less and less desirable to Harvey. I had read the script pretty early on when Miramax first bought it. They bought it from Castle Rock. It was a film which at Castle Rock, which was Rob Reiner's film, Rob Reiner's company, he was one of the 5 executives at Castle Rock. Rob Reiner had developed the film Good Will Hunting with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, and he had convinced them to cut out the action sequences.
Okay.
Like Will Hunting is a genius, and the FBI and the NSA and the CIA, they all want him.
Okay.
And they follow him in black limousines when he goes from his job to home to South Boston, and he often plays cat and mouse and like runs away from them. And so there are action sequences in the original script. And so Rob was according to Rob, he was like, you guys, you don't need these action sequences. The film works as a drama. It doesn't need action mixed in. He said, why do you have the action in the screenplay? And Matt and Ben said, well, to break into Hollywood. And he said, well, you're in Hollywood. We're Hollywood. We are Hollywood. So you're here. You don't need. We bought it. We bought the screenplay. So he convinced them to take that part out. So by the time Harvey bought it from Castle Rock, because Castle Rock had assigned a director that Matt and Ben didn't like. He was an executive. He wasn't a filmmaker. And they said, we don't want this guy to be the director. And Castle Rock made a deal. If you can get somebody to buy it from us within 30 days, which is a very short time, to get people to read it and come up with, there was $1 million price tag on it, which was huge for like an untried screenplay, and they were the leads. And Kevin Smith, Ben was in a Kevin Smith movie, the one where they're angels, like Ben and Matt are both angels.
Yeah,
Oh no, he was in Mallrats, not the angel, not Dogma. Ben was acting in Mallrats, and it was like their last day before the 30 days were up. And he said, Kevin, we have to sell our screenplay. And Kevin called Harvey, and Harvey, just on Kevin's recommendation, bought it. Which was fortunate for me. And he was shopping it to Robert Redford to direct and also play Sean, which was Robin's character. And Robert Redford said no. Then he went to Mel Gibson to direct and play Sean, and he said no. And it kept going that way until finally it was hitting like commercial direct. I said yes, but I wanted Final Cut, and Harvey said no. And so it kept going until finally the summer rolled around. It was like a whole season went by, a couple seasons went by, and Matt was cast by Francis Coppola in The Rainmaker, which was a John Grisham story. And Harvey realized, if Matt's in Good Will Hunting, we have the John Grisham kid, which he called him the John Grisham kid. He says, get it. He called Lawrence Bender, who produced Pulp Fiction, which was like one of his right-hand men. It's like, Lawrence, get this in production. This will come out after the Rainmaker. We'll have the John Grisham kid in our movie. We'll make a bunch of money. So that was the idea. Harvey claims this isn't true, but I was there. And so we went to Nashville where they were shooting The Rainmaker to work on the script, and we just were flying into production all of a sudden. I happened to be friends with somebody that was friends with Lawrence. So Lawrence knew I wanted to do it, and he hired me like in a minute. He was like, okay, you're hired. So we all flew there and started working on it and shot it that winter. And what was the question?
Well, how was your experience? But now this is great to
Shooting
hear.
it?
Yeah, well, if shooting and working with this script that.
Yeah, I think one of the questions is like there wasn't really a lot of hope with the movie, and any more hope than there was with To Die For or My Own Private Idahoe or Drugstore Cowboy. These are all movies that we hoped even got into theaters. I think they were all kind of unknown enough that we didn't really know what their fate would be. We of course hoped that they would win the Academy Award, but all filmmakers do, I think. So same with Good Will Hunting. We were just hoping to like not mess it up, and try and make something good. Robin I had worked a little bit with on Harvey Milk, which was the mayor of Castro Street. And Robin was going to play Harvey Milk. And it was a hand-me-down from Oliver Stone, who had decided not to shoot the mayor of Castro Street. So Robin was still the actor, and I was the replacement. And basically I had problems with the script, and I was dragging my feet, and all of a sudden I was fired, and they went on their way, and eventually I came around and made it later. But Robin was somebody I knew, and he was on our list. I think Harvey was checking again with like who's going to play Sean, and that character was going to be our box office, because Matt and Ben, I mean, we had the John Grisham kid, but Matt and Ben were not big names. So Robin was our one big name, or whoever played that part. So Robin, because he knew me partly, and I think he liked my work also, which he allowed me to play, take over for Oliver Stone, and he liked the script. He thought the whole thing was kind of great, and we also limited it to. He got a lot of money compared to everybody else, and we limited his shoot to like 3 weeks. We did it all at the same time, and it wasn't anything that any of us expected would really break out. When we showed it to the press, I think one of the reactions was a person who was in charge of booking the David Letterman show. She saw the movie, and they wanted Matt to go on the David Letterman show, and she just thought he couldn't carry a movie. She thought he was a bad actor. And so this was the first notice we got from the press. They would show the press. One of the typical things is to show press to see sort of what they might write about the movie and kind of react to it. And that was one of the first reactions. So I was going, okay, well, maybe she's right. Who knows? It works for me. But I always thought Matt was unbelievable. We actually tried to cast him in To Die For, which is where I met him, was earlier on. And so the hope was sort of limited until we tested it. And it tested very, very, very high in the 90s. So all of a sudden, after the test that night in New Jersey at the testing theater, John Gordon, our producer, called Harvey, who was in England. He said, Harvey, the movie scored 92. And he went, oi. And he says, call me later, because it was midnight. It was late there. And so he was happy to hear the test score. But and all of a sudden, he put his weight behind it and really pushed it. And when Harvey did that, it was good because he would spend money. And that was another part. It was Harvey pushing it for the Oscars and Harvey pushing it for the theaters as well. So it just worked out.
Elephant, Palme d'Or at Cannes, is your own script, and it's a great film, it's a masterpiece. And how was your experience to deal with death and violence in America? And were you prepared to what happened with that film?
Which film?
Elephant.
Oh, Elephant. Was I prepared for?
What's up?
Was I prepared for what?
For what happened with that film, as a
No,
statement, violence,
no, that was another surprise. I mean, Elephant was following. Elephant has a funny story. We had made Jerry in the desert with Matt Damon and Casey Affleck, and in the making of that story, we were. I think for the first time, I was working on a movie that had no script. We were going to make it up according to what we felt should happen. We would shoot the first scene first, and then the second scene, and keep going that way. We did have a story that we had read in the newspapers about these two boys who get lost in the desert. So we had that as a guide. One killed the other one, and only one guy was left, and he went to court. And they never really could figure out what happened, I mean, he became delusional, he said. He was delirious. He thought his friend was a monster, and like he had a penknife and killed him. So that in the ensuing like kind of attempt to like work with no script and being in the desert and so forth, I thought I was going to make like a John Cassavetes movie, but I had recently seen Bela Tarr's Satan Tango, and thought it was amazing. And I realized that cinematic like style was something that really would apply to what we were up to in the desert, because both Casey and Matt were becoming less and less forthcoming as kind of improvisers in front of the camera. They had something holding them back. So it started to become this different movie from what I thought we were making in the beginning. And I was applying this like style that I'd seen in Bela's movies to this project with no screenplay. And when I got finished with it, we had been simultaneously, I was working on Elephant, which was a project that was inspired by Columbine, was a reaction to Columbine. It was a way, I thought that in the world of the Columbine massacre and the press, it sort of followed something that happened in To Die For, something that happened when Kurt Cobain killed himself, is the press sort of became obsessed with the story, and it was a big, tragedy, and it appeared like on every newspaper, every magazine, every radio show, every documentary, and there was no, inclusion from, dramatists. Dramatists weren't allowed to kind of peek into the world of Columbine because dramatists made entertainment, and it was bad taste to investigate dramatically, the reason, what happened, why did these two guys, attack their own school. The reason was always, the question was always why, and the dramatists were left out. So the objective was, for me, was why not include the dramatists, and why not put it on television as a TV movie for everyone to see. So they saw it right away. Like, we make it fast, and we actually had a voice in the questioning of like, why did Columbine happen? And that didn't go over very well because the TV stations were worried. They were in threat of being shut down by Clinton because of just violence on TV, like police shows with guns was being targeted as the reason why. So nobody was going to make Columbine as an experiment. And so I was sort of, I was continuing to try and find a home for this idea, and through Diane Keaton, my agent also had Diane Keaton as a client, and he had a dinner with us where I explained to Diane this idea, and she said, let's take it to HBO, and she became the producer. And we went to Colin Callender at the time, was the head of HBO Films, and we told them that what we wanted to do, this idea, and he said that I can't do Columbine, but I can do Elephant. And Elephant was the Alan Clark film, which was made for BBC in 1989 as also a reaction to violence between Protestant and Catholic people during the Troubles in 1989. At the peak of the violence, he made this film, and they put it on the BBC. So he really knew what we were up to. He worked at the BBC at the time, and Danny Boyle was actually a co-director of Elephant, the original Elephant. So I asked him if we could use the title. Mostly, like, Colin was the guy, he always referred to it as Elephant, so we sort of inherited the title through Colin. Harmony Korine also said that Elephant was his favorite movie. So we asked him to write the script. And I think a year went by, and Harmony didn't write anything. So we decided to find a different writer. At the time, I was communicating with an author named J.T. Leroy, who was this very strange story, almost a Kenneth Anger story or something. It was an impersonated like character writing stories out of San Francisco. And so J.T. Leroy wrote a version of the script. And after Jerry played in Sundance, and it was the moment where we received a screenplay from J.T. for Elephant, which was pretty, by the book. It was a little boring. It was a little corny. So I decided to also use no screenplay for Elephant and do it in the fashion of Jerry. And also I was certain that HBO wasn't going to be interested in this idea of no screenplay and not famous actors. I explained it'll be in black and white. It'll be very slow. It'll be very austere, and it'll make you go to sleep. I was really underplaying it. I was trying to get out of the job because I had gotten JT a job. He got paid, and that was the whole point of it. And I was trying to exit out of the project. And so Colin said, "Well, we know that you're trying to get out of this project, but this is a very we think this project needs something new, and this is a perfect idea." I was like, "Okay." So I guess we're doing it still. So I, piece by piece, I said, "Okay, well, let's see if we can find the kids that we like." So we were casting the kids at the same time as I was kind of working on a style and a story. And I showed them Jerry, and I said, "This is what it's going to look like." And they said, "Fine." So they kept saying yes, because I think HBO at the time, it was, 2002, they really didn't have any filmmakers working that they liked. They had, they had relatively staid programming and biographical things, and they had their comedy specials, but it was a little different than it is now. I mean, now HBO, they did have The Sopranos, but the film division was a little bit conservative. So they were trying, also our budget was very tiny compared to these other films. So for them, it was not hard to give us $3 million. So we slowly went into this and made the film, showed it to Colin. Halfway through screening it, he started playing with the lamp next to him. He wasn't watching the screen. He was just playing with this lamp for a half an hour. And I thought, okay, he doesn't like it. But what he said he was doing at the end of the screening was just trying to figure out how to present it, and it was, I guess, his idea to go to Cannes. And it was just an ordinary. It was a nice trip to Cannes, but we really had no idea that it would catch on, and it was a surprise.
Thank you so much. I will stop the questions here in order that the people we can participate in a Q&A for Gus. Gracias, thanks. So okay, so he's going to take the. Por favor.
I don't know.
Hi,
I don't hear anything. Hello?
Hi, Mr. Van Sant, here. Thank you.
Hello?
No está escuchando.
No.
Okay, he's going to do it in English.
Oh, okay.
So, hi, Mr. Van Sant. Thank you for being here. Could you talk a little bit more about the method you prefer to use with your actors when you're directing them? I mean, do you make a lot of previous readings? You like to rehearse, or you don't, if it's the case, or you try to improve new things on the set every day? How do you work? How do you relate with your actors, with your cast? Thank you.
Usually, I try to get to know them as well as I can. Sometimes, depending on the actor, like they're very like into sort of getting to know each other very well, so that you're like when you get to the set, it's you know, you're friends, and you can communicate, and you're like so usually that works out. Occasionally, you know, there's a distance. Occasionally, that's too intimate for the actor, just to have dinner and to like talk on the phone. But generally, like that's first step. You're always talking about the project. You're talking about things that relate to the project. Maybe you're talking about the character. I tend to not talk about the character. I talk about people that are like the character, but I don't necessarily talk about the character. Because I'm like letting them come up with their ideas about the character. Let's see. Then the next step is like when, you know, you're scheduled to shoot, there'll be a few weeks, maybe 2 weeks, where the actor arrives and before the first day of shooting, and you're doing different things. We are rehearsing. I'll put aside a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours each day for rehearsals, and the rest of the day the characters are maybe doing costumes or you know, or just meetings, general meetings, or they're working with themselves together. So there's that period, and during the rehearsals, I think Drugstore Cowboy was the first time I had a traditional rehearsal. So it would have been like the 4 main people. There's Heather Graham, James LeGros, Kelly Lynch, Matt Dillon. So we'd sit around the table and choose scenes to do, read through it. We would also, because of that group, we also just went off the page. They would just improv things because it would amuse them. They liked that, all 4 of them. That's also something that sometimes actors like shy away from. Like they want to go from the page and stay on the page. But in the case of Drugstore Cowboy, they would just go off. And I think I remember getting up and getting in a car and driving to a drugstore with the characters and having them be in character. And I remember we had a fender bender. We had a car accident on the way to the drugstore, and the characters dealt with it like in character and talked to the other person driving, and they were all in character. And Kelly was like yelling at Matt because they were a married couple, and I found that very useful to just. And they found it I guess they found it useful. It was very entertaining. It was funny. So by the time we got on the set, they could just sort of be the characters, and there was a lot of dialogue in that screenplay, probably because of my newness to adapting screenplays. Just huge blocks of dialogue, which I think was good for Matt's character, because in general he was a man of few words, but all of a sudden, Drugstore Cowboy, he was a blabbermouth, you know. So there is that period, the rehearsal period. During the shoot, I'm usually just like trying to indulge the actors. I'm trying to just say yes all the time, almost, which isn't good because then they get used to that and they expect anything, like training a dog, like, you know, too many treats. So I can run into trouble, but I do like to sort of, they come up with ideas and I usually go like, yeah, do it. Yeah, of course, do that. So it helps them, I think, unless you spoil them too much, it helps the actors feel like they have part. They're helping, they're creating, as opposed to just saying the lines and leaving the room. They're actually part of the whole process. And it's, you know, they get excited and they seem to work harder. Thanks. Sure. You want me to choose?
¿Quién es la segunda pregunta?
Oh, hi Gus, here. Fernanda for Top Cinema. I wanted to ask precisely about Don't Worry, He Won't Go Far and Fit. Why did you decide to tell the story about Callahan? I think it's probably one of my favorite movies from the last few years. It's a very interesting story. I think it's a story that everyone needs to hear. But how did you get involved with this project? Thanks.
That was a project where Robin Williams, after doing Good Will Hunting, he and his wife, they had a production company, Marsha Williams, and it was at, I can't remember, I think it was Sony, and they had these books that they had bought. One was called Kid, which was a Dan Savage book about a gay couple adopting a kid in Portland, Oregon. They were both Portland, Oregon stories that they sent me. So it was Kid, and then there was Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot, which was John Callahan's story, novel that he'd written in 89, I think, or 88. And so I knew John personally. I hadn't read the book, but I knew that it existed. I knew his story because there was sort of like cartoons that he would do in the local newspaper that would sort of be about the same story, about his alcoholism, his accident, his recovery, physical recovery, then his also alcohol recovery in cartoons that he would do. So I kind of knew the idea. I read the book, and I said, yeah, let's work on Don't Worry. So along with Robin Williams and Marsha Williams, we developed a few screenplays. We wrote, I think, 4 drafts. And it was always sort of hitting a wall. I think it was challenging for Sony or for whoever was going to fund it to like let Robin do one of his own projects that they felt wasn't, might have, may not be like what they wanted. Maybe too difficult for them to like to envision as a moneymaker, and so I never really knew what was happening behind the curtain, but it never sort of came about. And then years went by, and Robin died in 2012, and somewhere around there, Sony called, and they had the property. They had bought the book for Robin, and they wanted to know if I wanted to like revisit it, and that's kind of like where it came from. Also, Callahan had died, but we wrote the first 4 drafts with him. We were always hanging out with John and sort of asking him questions. So I knew a lot about John. We interviewed him. I had tapes of John talking. So we eventually made it, and it was very truthful to the book. It was sort of like going back to Drugstore Cowboy, just trying to make John's voice in the book come alive.
Hi, Mr. President. You just spoke about the process of Good Will Hunting, but I wanted to ask you, what does the movie personally means to you, and what memories will you keep of Robin Williams?
Can you repeat the question?
Too fast.
Sorry. You spoke about the process of making Good Will Hunting, but what does this movie means to you, and what personal memories will you keep of Robin Williams?
Well, I mean, there comes a point usually in every movie that sometimes the attraction to a subject means something to you. There's one particular thing that means something to you, or maybe there's a group of things. But as you progress, who said it? I think Truffaut said, making a movie is like a trip through the Old West on a stagecoach. You hope for a pleasant trip, but by the end you're just praying that you stay alive. I mean, so those initial like sort of reasons that you make things sometimes disappear, or many times disappear because either new reasons or new problems, or going into the middle of the psychology of the characters isn't necessarily what you were originally touched by. You know, it changes, everything changes. So at the end, you're just hoping to finish the film, and your intentions are kind of shot, and everything. It's like, you know, everything changes. So Good Will Hunting, I think, I mean, it was obvious to me. It was gimmicky in the sense that the guy was this brilliant genius, and we were expected to believe that the janitor is answering the questions on the board, which was inspired by Ben Affleck's father, Tim Affleck, who worked as a janitor at Harvard, and who could have answered maybe the questions on certain, you know, in certain departments' boards, but he was somehow stuck as a janitor. And the kids would ask him, "Why are you the janitor? You're a genius. We know you're a genius. You worked with David Wheeler at his theatrical company, and you're like the in-house genius." And he said, "Well, somebody has to do this job." And he was being very dutiful and socialistic, and like, somebody, this is a good job. This is an important job. Somebody needs to push the broom. And he was, in fact, hiding something. Tim Affleck was hiding a drinking problem, and nobody really knew. So this idea that the character was very smart, but he had, you know, something that he was hiding, something he was holding on to secretly, and people even knew, his friends even knew. In the case of Will, he was hiding that he didn't want anything to change. He didn't want to grow up. He wanted to just always be with his friends. He didn't want to mature, even though he was had distinct possibilities. So that was the gimmick worked on me. I saw a lot of things in it. I saw the psychology of the character. I fell for it, and you know, they were kind of working in writing the script to kind of like make that you know, that character and his evolution, you know, the main attraction of the story. And that was what it meant to me. The other question. What was? Oh, Robin Williams. Yeah, Robin, I mean, was incredibly funny on set, as he would be. He had a habit of, if he was here, of course, you guys would be laughing the whole time. He needs to have you laugh. And as you laugh, it fuels him to make you laugh harder. So I think he was a man who could actually kill people with laughter, you know, like, because they wouldn't be able to breathe. They would be laughing so hard. So he was sort of like that. Either that was on, or he was like this. So he was very quiet, silent, or he was like trying to make you laugh. If you talked to him seriously about a subject, he was very smart. If you were as smart as he was, which I wasn't, you could engage him about art or math, or, you know. So I never really had those types of relationships with him. Usually, he was morose, and I think people have told me that there's a reason for that. I'm not sure. I think partly in my case, it might have been he didn't want me to think that he was going to be Mr. Jokester, that he was a serious actor, and he didn't want to like make me laugh. I was trying to crack jokes, which he didn't find funny, but he would never encouraging him to crack jokes when we were alone. When we were on set, the crew was there, so he'd like the focus puller. He'd see him sitting there, and he'd start cracking jokes for that guy. Then the cameraman would laugh, and then all of a sudden the whole crew would be laughing as we were working. And I remember David Cronenberg came. We were shooting in Canada. He came to the set to visit, and since it was a Canadian crew, Cronenberg knew all these crew members. And he was standing. It was after lunch, and Robin was making the crew laugh, and David said out loud, "Wow, it is noisy in here." And all of a sudden, Robin shut up, like he knew that the director, a different director, had made like sort of an announcement. And I said, "Yeah, it's like different guy, different director." So there was that side. There was when I was working with him, I usually, when I'm directing, I usually just kind of either I get the shot and move on, or with Robin, he always wanted to do like a funny one, a sad one, a fast one, a slow one, a medium one. I think in an effort to give you a lot of material so you could choose the right one that was going to work for the scene. But I generally don't give like specific directions. But Robin was smart enough to just read your slight facial expressions, very slight, and he would read your mind. He would know what you liked. He would know if you were happy or not without talking. So those are the things I remember.
You mentioned earlier in your career that the template for modern film and the rules of engagement for film, for cinema. Do you feel like that as a filmmaker in the current changes in platforms, smaller screens, people watch on their phones, et cetera, that's impacted you as a filmmaker, other filmmakers, and how? And then my second question would be, what are you called to next, in this very rapidly changing, social and political world that we all live in? What kind of subject matter might you be drawn to next? Thank you.
The whole impact of I think of it as the the computer on not only filmmaking but on every aspect of our lives has been huge in many different ways. Politically, I mean, everything politically is very, very tenuous and scary and unbelievable, and there's that aspect which just translating to the sort of cinematic world. It's people are watching so many different types of things that whenever I see a young person looking at their phone and laughing and or just only looking at their phone, I always kind of want to see what it is, and if I ask or look at what they're watching, it's something very, very odd. Like in one case, it was just a woman in an SUV that had a pink interior, and she was eating vegetarian food for the first time and making a face, and that was hilarious to them. And that the sort of what cinema is to a certain generation and or to the modern day has changed and or is changing. That storytelling isn't necessarily the main attraction. It's been going that direction for so long, and I think we all sort of watched it, going on. I think that independent filmmakers were always hoping for the downfall of the Hollywood stranglehold, and now that it actually is falling, you realize that you're part of it. It's been pulling you with it, it's streaming and the influence of, say, Netflix and Amazon. I've made an Amazon film. It's confusing in the sense that their idea of what they're doing with the movie, where it's going, what it's for, is not the same as the old time. We're going to put it in a theater and people are going to come and watch the movie in a theater. The theaters are all dying. The attractions in theaters are action-oriented. Action, obviously, is dominating. They're willing... I think that a lot of times Hollywood has been sort of misled by its own sort of successes. If they make a $300 million movie and advertise it for another $300 million, and it makes, $800 million, they're happy, but you're kind of feeling, or at least from my point of view, it seems like a risky venture. Seems very strange, but it does sort of mirror other types ventures, you know, like architecturally or politically or other types of things that are kind of overkill and, you know, overgrown. But the streaming aspect is odd. Like, where does that film go? Where does Don't Worry, You Won't Get Far on Foot? I'm happy to see it's here, and I'm happy to see that maybe it had a run in the theaters here, but it's no longer the main event. You know, the dramatic film or comedic film or even action film, they're sort of no longer, they're competing with games, sports, people buying stuff. They're competing with so many things that they never did before. That is kind of, it's very much changing, and it's sometimes distracting and makes you feel sad, but then other times you acclimate, you know. So I'm trying to acclimate.
We have time for one last question.
Mr. Van Sant.
I just, what I'm drawn to is usually a character that's in the middle of an environment that the most exciting thing is an environment I've never heard of. You know, so if it's, say, I mean, a lot of times it's, you know, it's just like an environment I would never expect that, or don't know about and would never expect existed. Say, I don't know, it could be anything, like horse racing or space exploration or shoe sales, toy salesman. Like Vince Vaughn had a toy salesman script. They thought it's the world of toy makers and toy sales. It's an environment I have no idea, but it's very established. It could be almost anything, but when you're describing the environment along with the character, it's information. It's new information. It's educational and exciting and interesting.
Mr. Van Sant, hi. Gonzalo Hurtado de Cine para Llevar. His characters moves between marginality and incomprehension. What is fascinating about them?
Which film?
Others, his characters.
All of the characters?
Yeah, sure.
They move between
marginality and incomprehension.
I mean, that was and what? Incomprehension. Oh, really? Well, the marginality, I think, is part of that. Like, you know, it's a new environment that you haven't. The marginal side is like we've never seen that world. I mean, a lot of times, yeah, they're like marginal in the sense marginal in their relationship to society, because I think that's my own personal view of my own relationship to the world. But incomprehension. Is that the right word? You got the wrong word, I think. Incomprehension. You mean? Yeah, that nobody understands them. Oh, I see. Yeah.
They don't have the ability to.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's just my own relationship to the world.
Okay, so please give a big applause to Gus Van Sant. Thank you so much, maestro. Gracias. Gracias a todos.